You're listening to Ricky and Jimmy on Relationships, the show where we uncover the thoughts and behaviors that are sabotaging your relationship and what you can do about it. Jimmy and I are passionate about sharing the ways that imperfect partners like you and I can shift unhealthy relational dynamics and create closeness. So welcome. Drop your defenses and open your heart, eyes, and ears. Let's learn how to be the best partner we can be together. Welcome back, everybody. Today, Jimmy and I are really excited because we have my favorite Instagram sex therapist, Dr. Lauren Fogel Mersy. She's a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist. And today we're going to be talking about her book, Desire. And let me in on your co-author too, because she can't be here today, but we want to give her a mention as well. I know she's a big part of this also.
Absolutely. That's Dr. Jennifer Wenzel, and she is one of my heroes for writing this with me.
Well, that's wonderful. Jimmy, do you want to start us out with a question or comment? I know you weren't ready for that, but
no, I am totally. So here's what I loved so many things about the book, but one of the things that was so fascinating to me is. So what I'll do is I'll jump into the quote and then you can kind of just elaborate on it, because it's such a fascinating quote. And I feel like when we don't get this right in our relationships, especially from a sexuality standpoint, it can really suffer. But this is a quote by Joan Lucas. "Willingness may be the most important part of your sexual experience, not desire or orgasm." Sorry to throw out the O word right away. You know, there's going to be.
We got to break people in early.
Yeah, this is a PG-13. You know, we're going to try to keep it as PG as we can, but there's going to be some, not awkwardness, but you know what I mean. The reason I love that is because you talk about things like spontaneous desire versus responsive desire, and how a lot of times you can start from a neutral standpoint. And but that willingness is so important. Can you elaborate on how to navigate that dynamic of? Yeah. I'm not sure if that's a good question, but
well, hey, maybe before we get too deep, let's not assume that the audience knows the difference between spontaneous and responsive desire. I'm not new to the topic. I'm a big fan of Come As You Are, which is another book that we've mentioned on here before. But reading through your book, I have to say, this is maybe the first time that I've really identified myself as somebody who tends to experience a lot more responsive desire as opposed to spontaneous. And I can't say how helpful that is in navigating my own sexual adventure with my partner. So let's talk about that first a little bit. Jimmy, did that part do anything for you too?
Yeah, that was good.
Let's talk about the fact that society tends to only talk about and recognize spontaneous sexual desire, where you're just walking along and then suddenly you have a sexual thought or desire. That's what everybody thinks is the only way it should be. Lauren, why don't you talk a little bit about that? It was so eloquent in the book, and I know I'm going to butcher it if I try to.
Oh, thank you. I borrow Dr. Emily Nagoski's sort of definition of this when I talk about it, when I share it with people I work with and just speaking about it, because she talks about spontaneous desire as desire that emerges in anticipation of pleasure. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like this, I call it like the lightning bolt of horny that just kind of comes over you. And it's just
I know that lightning bolt very well.
Yeah. You're just like, bam, I could go for some sex, and I'm into it. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of anticipation of what's to come and seeking out something that's pleasurable or arousing. And to your point, Ricky, that's predominantly what we see in the media. That's what we hear. That's what we all think desire is across the board. Mm-hmm. And yet what we've found in, decades of research is that is not how it works for everyone. And a good chunk of the population have a different style or experience around desire. And so This comes from Rosemary Bassan's work back in 2000, which was then popularized by Emily Nagoski in her, groundbreaking book, Come As You Are.
So good. Yeah.
And so we've been using that for several years now. And so responsive desire is desire that emerges in response to something that's pleasurable or arousing or stimulating. So it's just an inverse sort of way to get into a sexual response cycle. So for some people, it's the desire first and then more of an arousal, that comes afterwards. And for others, it's more like arousal first. Mm-hmm. Desire comes next. So the desire is sparked from something that's either pleasurable or arousing to either look at or touch or feel or experience. So some sort of stimulation.
I also really loved how you mentioned in the book, you and your co-author mentioned that there's not a better way. There's not a right way to become aroused. Like, I know so many of us with responsive desire feel like we're broken or something's wrong with us if that lightning bolt's not just hitting us out of nowhere. And there's really a lot of compassion that you guys encourage in those partners who have the spontaneous, like, hey, here are some things that you can do for your responsive partner to help get them ready for it like you are.
Yeah.
That was so great.
So many times people come in, especially in sex therapy, and they have more of the responsive style and they feel exactly that. They feel broken. They feel like something's wrong. They feel like something's lacking. They are usually the quote unquote lower libido partner in their dyad. And I often say, sort of with quotations, lower libido, higher libido, because it is often in relation to a dynamic. So it's like, what are we measuring it against? Is it a previous version of yourself at a different stage in life? Is it measuring that against your partner? That can change based on what you're using as your barometer. So I like to also caveat that, low libido doesn't really mean anything to me until I have a lot more context about, the relationship, the individual, the circumstances. But responsive desire and spontaneous desire are just both valid ways to experience sexual desire and sexuality. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the missions we're on, is to normalize that and to help people understand that. I'm so glad to hear that you even benefited from that, just from hearing more about that.
Oh, absolutely. I know I wasn't, this is a topic that I love and I read a lot about. So I didn't go into this expecting to learn as much as I did. It really, like, the whole book was like a course on it. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah. Wonderful.
It's very meaty,
Wonderful. So then I think back to, Jimmy, what you were saying about willingness, that comes from Joanne Lulin. And she wrote about this years ago, sort of saying that what precedes then the experience of desire and responsive desire is an openness or willingness to experience something that's pleasurable. Because if it's a bad time for you, if the context is poor, that willingness is going to make or break what happens next. Mm-hmm. And we caveat that with, like, you're not meant to be willing all the time. It's not about, you lack willingness, that's the problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But it's more like, you may not have, we use an analogy of like a microwave and an oven. Right. The oven may not already be on, but are you willing to go do a preheat and see, what it's like to come up to temp?
I know this stuff is super nuanced, but like, I guess if I was an audience, I mean, I am an audience, but like, I would kind of be wondering, because a lot of things go into that. Like if I'm putting myself in a woman's shoes who is an oven and they're a quote unquote lower libido in relation to their partner, obviously for some of those people, they feel like, well, I want to be, I want to meet my partner's needs. I want to be more willing. And I'm hearing that like willingness is so important, but like, how do I know if I'm stretching myself a little bit too much, or if I truly am like, okay, I want to give this a try? I guess it's more of like a if I give this a try and then I don't feel it, then it's like I'm able to be honest and say like, I'm not feeling it. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's a piece of it, is that we need to know that you can say, hey, I'm not experiencing desire in this moment. I'm open to go and connect with you and do some touching and have some intimate time and kind of see what comes of that. And if it doesn't really, cultivate desire for me, or if I decide midway that I'm just not feeling it in this moment, I have to have the ability to say, you know what, hey babe, it's just not sort of working for me right now.
Yeah.
Either A, is there something else that we can do to just, lie here together, talk, rub your back, you rub my back, something, to make it a positive connection, or to say, hey, let's rain check for a time where I can get more into it so that we're having good experiences together. But I think the other thing I would add is that, when we're talking about willingness and sort of the motivation for, being open to a sexual experience, what's missing for a lot of people, and I'll say I see this more among women than I do with men, is that, the motivation and the willingness is sort of what you were saying, like to please my partner, to show up for my partner, to be there to satisfy my partner. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently. That's a very nice and lovely thing. The problem we get into is if that's the main or only reason that you're showing up for sex, and you're really not factoring in what would be pleasurable and enjoyable and satisfying for you, it's not very long before you're not willing, you're not motivated, and you're not even experiencing responsive desire.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. That's something that I'm really excited to talk to my partner about. I have not discussed with him all the things that I've read in the book yet, but I can't wait to, because I know that for him, in particular, he's often pretty bummed when I reveal that I'm not in the mood. If I say like, I'm not in the mood right now, but I'm willing to do things to get there, that really kind of bums him out sometimes as somebody who has more spontaneous desire. And it really, and from what you were saying in the book, it shouldn't,
Yeah. Well, I think it makes sense to me that it would bum someone out if their only model for desire is that it comes from this spontaneous lightning bolt place. And that if it doesn't, that means something's wrong. And most of us, we have a negativity bias in our brains. We skew negative when we're absent of data, and we do that to survive and protect ourselves. So what mostly happens to, let's say, someone in your partner's shoes is filling in a story about why that is, why you may not have that spontaneous desire. And what it usually goes to, the default I hear so often, because we're such vulnerable and sensitive creatures, is there's, she's not attracted to me. There's something wrong with me. I did something, wrong. She's upset. So it very quickly can go from something very gentle, like I'm just not, in a place to even go cultivate desire, or, hey, I am willing to go cultivate desire. It can so quickly just, brush on these tender parts of us and go right to a raw spot of, I'm not wanted, I'm not desired, I'm doing something wrong.
I felt like I picked up so much of that in the book, where it's like shame plays into so much of this, and you see it across so much. And it's just like what you're talking about, where you really have to have a solid foundation between each other and with yourself, because when you don't, like, shame just creeps in there and fills in the gaps. And if they were willing, but then they pull back and say, you know what, it turns out it's just not working for me. It's very, very difficult, I know from personal experience, to not take that as rejection and just take that as, oh, that's perfectly fine. Like, it's just not working tonight. That's perfectly, it's so much easier just to go, it's me. Clearly it's me. Like, I didn't do something. If I would have just done X, Y, and Z better, or, all kinds of things that can creep in. And shame just plays a massive role in our own cultivating desire within, or, like, even just like loving ourselves and being just the willingness to like get comfortable enough to, you know, experience arousal sometimes. It's amazing how all this stuff in your mind, you know, just manifests itself.
Mm-hmm. It goes right to our insecurities, and it hits that so frequently. And, you know, we can make a good case in our own minds without, you know, verbalizing and communicating with our partners. You know, here's the story I've got about why you're not experiencing spontaneous desire. The story is about some sort of inadequacy in me. And then my next move relationally is likely to be one that's leaning more towards an insecure move, right? Something like, I'm going to go off and sulk. I'm going to go withdraw. I'm going to call you frigid. I'm going to do something that's rooted in my own insecurity to try to make sense of what's happening and try to, you know, figure out, you know, where do I go from here? And so I think that's, you know, also being a couples therapist and a relationship therapist, this is one of the areas that we work on, you know, when folks are coming to see me is, hey, what's that narrative that you're telling yourself? Like, what is going through your mind? And then can you tell that directly to your partner? Because let them weigh in on whether that's based in their truth, whether that's more of a fear story, you know, because sometimes it takes us saying, hey, I hear you saying that you're not really feeling it. And I'm feeling, you know, pretty insecure about that. It's kind of bringing up some, you know, thoughts like maybe I did something wrong. Maybe you're not into me. Your partner gets an opportunity then to be a loving presence with you and to say, hey, you know, even though I'm not maybe feeling sex right now, I'm here. I care about you. I love you. I desire you. It also gives you an opportunity to get out of this all or none framework around sex. I love that.
I wanted to bring that up so bad.
Yeah.
Because so often it's like you're either feeling it or you're not. You're having sex or you're not.
Right.
But there's so many things you can do.
But for my partner and I, when we accepted that maybe like, gosh, I don't want to make this too explicit. My mom might listen to this. When we accepted that, how do you say, like, the traditional way of thinking about a sexy evening, right, was not necessarily the way that it needed to go. When we're like, there's lots of other things that we can do and still have a really great and very sexual time together. It really was a game changer because it made those nights, not only were they a lot more varied, but there was a lot less pressure for it to look and go a certain way every time.
Right. Most therapists will call that the standard or typical sexual script.
Yes.
In our book, we call it the sexual staircase.
I loved the staircase.
Sort of,
I saw that. I was like, that looks familiar. That looks like the way it should go. And the very next page was like, not necessarily.
It's just a nice sort of depiction, visual of what so many of us know. And it doesn't surprise me that you'd look at it and say like, oh yeah, that looks familiar. Yeah. Because I think it's been handed down to us as like, this is what sex is. And it's, first of all, very heteronormative. It says there's a man and a woman involved. It says, here's what the man is supposed to do. Here's what the woman is supposed to do. Here's where it starts and here's where it ends. And it doesn't really give you a lot of opportunity to, you know, kind of choose your own adventure, create your own atmosphere. And it also assumes that that's what everybody wants to do 100% of the time for their entire life.
Which is nuts. There's so many other things that are fun and that we want. Yeah.
It also means that when you experience a challenge, right? Let's say you can't get an erection. Let's say you're not having an orgasm. It's just not happening for you. Let's say the desire is not spontaneous. Those tend to be, in that framework, showstoppers then. Then it's like game over, go off to your corners. This was a big failure. It's a huge disappointment. And it can be really hard to come back from.
For the folks who have not read the book, Lauren, would it be okay if I described the sexual staircase?
Yeah, absolutely.
And apologies to my mother, because this is going to get a little explicit, but I think it's important for listeners to know. So for those of you who can't see, I'm looking at a staircase and in Lauren's book, and at the bottom step, it starts out with just touching, and the next step up is kissing, and the next step up is caressing, and it goes up like that, up to genital touch, oral sex, penetrative sex, and finally in orgasm. And it's like, I think most of our whole lives we've been told that if it doesn't look like that, if your night doesn't progress exactly like that and hit every single step, you're a failure, and the night was a failure. And that's what you say in the book too. That's a really common way for people to think, and it's just simply not the way it is at all.
Yeah. It's how most of us have been introduced or taught, what sex looks like. And the problem that we see as sex therapists over and over again is just how that framework, when it's used too rigidly, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with having an experience that looks like that. That's
Sure.
absolutely fine. That they can be lovely experiences, assuming that's A, what you want, and then
Right.
B, that if something doesn't happen to, line up, that it doesn't have to be a huge deal breaker. It doesn't have to be a big deal. So the other model, the other sort of visual we use is more like a wheel or a circular kind of open-ended model that says, these don't have to be hierarchical. They don't have to be linear. They don't have to start here and end here. You can do a little bit of this, that, and the other. And then next time you can throw in a little something else. Next time you can remove. So you can have multiple pathways to be intimate and sexual.
It was so comforting to look at that wheel. I was like, oh, I really liked that other step. I want to go back to that. And nothing was higher, nothing was lower. It was just, I liked the choose your own adventure reference too. That was nice also.
Yeah. The 80s and 90s kids will know that one. That you get to design or create your experience. The more flexible our sexual script or experience is, the more likely we're going to have positive and satisfying experiences across a lifespan. Because as you get older, as your relationship goes on in years, if you have children, as your body changes, trying to follow and adhere to this one way forever becomes more and more difficult. And actually what we found is that folks who have more flexibility around sex so that it can look like different things, it can go different ways, it can happen, in a variety of sort of ways over time, they tend to have better experiences, which is not shocking when we really look at that, right?
Nope. I'm sure you've seen the study too. They polled lots of women, and they found that the more sexual activities that happened within a session, the more likely a woman was to orgasm during that session. And I thought that was really neat too, and also incredibly different from the staircase that we're used to,
Yeah.
So that was nice too, just a little something that we can do to close that orgasm gap. I don't remember you talking about that in the book, but that's another favorite topic of mine as well.
Absolutely. And I don't know that we referenced it directly in the book, but boy, is that something that is still an ongoing thing today.
A very big issue.
Unfortunately, that heterosexual women, for those who are not familiar with the study, heterosexual women are having the least amount or the fewest amount of orgasms with partnered sex than
By
any
far.
other, sexual orientation or gender. Yeah.
So I really, on behalf of the heterosexual women out there, thank you so much for writing this book. There's a lot in here that's really helpful. We are a struggling population sexually, so this was super helpful.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
I think one of the things that helped me, I not necessarily right before this book, but before I started on this journey of just like trying to learn more about relationships and, sexuality is obviously a part of that. But myself, I remember clearly thinking that if, my wife didn't have an orgasm, then it wasn't then I didn't do something right, or it wasn't
right.
or even attaching it to her, like I would say she must not have had a good time in my head.
Right.
But like, that's so untrue. Like that even in she might even tell you that and you still won't believe her. She'll be like, no, everything was great. And you're like, yeah, you're just saying that, you know, but it's so sad how many men out there think that has to be it's just amazing how we box ourselves into that.
Yeah. And I
to
think
the detriment of both partners also, right? That's no fun for you or your wife if that's what's being said.
Right. And I think it's nuanced because
Go ahead.
I don't want you to, you know, be in a situation where someone's completely ignoring that. If you want an orgasm or if you're interested in pursuing that, that should be available, you know, and maybe again with flexibility, having, you know, different ways to make that experience happen. But it also doesn't have to be so rigidly adhered to, right? Like it has to happen 100% of the time. It has to happen in a very particular way, because that sort of boxed in, like you said, can then become sort of a fresh concern in and of itself, right? Yep. And I like to remind people that there is nobody I've ever met who has 100% sexual function, sexual response 100% of the time forever.
That's really comforting. Right. Thank you for saying that also. Yeah. That's
You're
nice
going to have times where you don't get aroused or you don't have the desire, the responsive desire doesn't even maybe emerge. You can't orgasm. You lose steam. You get a Charlie horse. Like things happen.
Yeah.
So we have to have that flexibility.
I think one of the things that confuses me, and I know that both of you can touch on this better than I could, but so being the higher desire partner, obviously, and actually caring and loving for my wife, I wouldn't want her ever doing anything that she didn't want to do, truly.
Right.
However, there is like you said, there's a nuance there where just because she starts out not in the mood or not having a desire, that doesn't mean that she can still choose to pursue a path of like being open to physical arousal, which might lead to desire.
Yeah.
How do I, like, I guess I might have already asked that question in the beginning, but how do I make sure that she feels safe enough that I'm not coercing her, or that I'm not, or that, because it feels like it's very like, well, maybe you should try to, if she's not really in the mood, like, and I'm like, hey, maybe you should try. Like it feels wrong to say that. It feels wrong to say, well, maybe you should try. Is that, that obviously should come from her. She should be, but there's a lot of people that don't know this information. So I'm just saying, like, is that something that we should, like, that should come from ourselves, obviously?
You're pointing out something that, and we were really conscious about, writing that section, because this is a very nuanced piece here around willingness, right? Willingness, like you said, it comes from within. You can't coerce it. You can't pressure it. You can't, wear someone down, because that's not really willingness.
Sure.
That's just, I was coerced and I went along to make that stop, and that's really then not consent. So, you're beautifully saying, I want to protect my wife, myself, Absolutely. Our relationship from having that happen. So it's not on me to push willingness in another person.
Right.
But it is something, as a higher desire partner, what you can do is bring up the topic and say, hey, I was reading this book, or I was hearing this podcast and they were talking about this, and how do you think of this? And does that fit for your experience? And is that something that we might, have some interest to incorporate? One of the things we talk about is, coming up with a scale. Like, I'm a 10 out of 10 totally up for this. Does not necessarily mean I have spontaneous desire, but I'm up for, getting close, letting our skin touch, being, in an intimate space. You might be more like a 1 out of 10, where it's like, I'm just really not there at all. Not for responsive, not for any of it. And both
I think we're
okay.
smiling because Jimmy and I talked about the scale in our libido difference episode.
I was thinking about that, Ricky.
Yeah, we had so much fun with it. We were like, so what is a 4?
What is a 4 out of 10? What's a 4?
And you mentioned this in the book too, that a 4 means something different for everybody who talks about their 4.
Right.
So that was
Which is
fun.
then really inviting us to talk to our partners about what that means, because it's one thing to use something like, the Likert scale, or some people do like green light, yellow light, red light, something to sort of make it, simplistic to express. But you also want to have some conversation about, like, what does that mean? So if you say to me, I'm a 5, let's also pair with that the conversation of what does a 5 look like or feel like for you? How would you like me to respond when you tell me that, right? Like if you say you're a 5, are you looking to me, maybe the higher libido partner, to say, no sweat, I'm here. Let me know if you want to, get something going, and it's on you. Or as a 5, like, hey, let's, head to a private space, and, why don't you follow me, take my lead, and let's just see what happens.
Yeah.
So you do such a good job in the book at mentioning how vital those conversations are. And what saddens me is I feel like they are rare, and I wish they weren't, but I feel like so many couples, I mean, including me and Emily in the past, like just either didn't have them, didn't know how to have them, didn't think they were important. And it's incredibly detrimental and foundational. When you're talking about any of this stuff, you can't really execute on any of it unless you both are. You even say you say somewhere, I won't be able to find it, but you say there's no way to improve your sexual relationship without talking about it. And it's like, if you can't have these conversations, then you're really set up, to not to fail, but you're really set up to struggle.
Yeah. Well, because if you remove the script, which, by the way, none of us really said, hey, this is the script I want to follow. It was just given to you.
Yeah.
So now you have to look at it and say, hey, does this fit for me at all? Does it fit for me some of the time? Does it fit for me none of the time? There are plenty of people who say penetration is not for us.
Right.
And so we just don't do it. And that doesn't mean that they don't have a sexual life. So you get to sort of decide what does sex look like for us. But if you take the script away, the one that everybody just says, this is what it is, now you have to talk to each other about what you're doing, because you don't have sort of a mental model of what that looks like that both of you are aligned with, unless you verbalize that, unless you talk about it. The wheel cannot happen without communication.
Yeah, so vital.
And it can be, I mean, I'm sure the listeners would agree, it's not easy to have those conversations if they're not conversations that you've been having. So as somebody who struggles to talk to their partner about things like that, I do feel like it gets easier with practice. And I am still pretty bad at it. I get pretty nervous when I initiate conversations like that. But it is getting better with time and practice. Even with a supportive partner who's like, I really want to hear all these things that you have to say, it can still be so hard for me to pull the words out of myself, Me
too.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I think that's right on. It does take practice. And even despite the practice, because we live in the culture that we do, there might always be, or there might often be, a twinge of like, this is a little uncomfortable, or it feels
I'm glad
like
you said that. I was waiting for it to go away, and it hasn't gone away yet. So maybe it won't. Yeah.
It may not. And even if it doesn't, we can, usually it's sort of like expanding what we call like a window of tolerance around these conversations. So instead of just avoiding it completely, can I just like open a door to the conversation? Can I take just like a bite-sized piece of the conversation? Because maybe I can't talk at length about all my desires and fantasies and wants, and but maybe I can just say, hey, do you think you might ever want to mix up sort of how we have sex so that it's a bit more flexible and open-ended? How would you feel about that? So you're just asking one question.
Can I jump in? One thing that I obviously felt like I needed to do some more work on when I was reading the book is, well, first of all, I don't want to pigeonhole it's not, this isn't everyone. Like I don't feel like I have I must have a very low tolerance for what affects my libido. Obviously that's not everyone. I mean, like,
Right.
and I don't want to say women, but like I feel like a lot of women it's not like that for them, where I don't want to say men, but the stereotypical man, he would have sex if it was the apocalypse. It doesn't matter. Like it's, and one thing you go into detail in the book is just how much can affect someone's libido, male or female.
Yeah.
Can you talk about like some of the most common ones that you see just come up over and over again that maybe people don't pay attention to, that would really help people, like, hey, you got to pay attention to these. Both partners need to be paying attention to this.
Ooh,
Yeah.
and can we start this with the SES and the SIS? Can we tell
just
people a
gonna
little bit
talk
about that?
about
Because I
that.
love
Yeah.
that. So, okay, take it away, Lauren.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about that. Yeah, the sexual accelerators and sexual breaks is just a sort of colloquial way of talking about some complex systems that occur in our bodies and brains. And this is based on research, goes back, many years. The basic premise is that your sexuality is going to have a whole host of things that will hit the accelerator, i.e. move you toward sex or feel more either desire or arousal for sex. And then there's a whole bunch of things that can hit the brakes. And that's going to be really individual based on, each person, each partnership. Now, for folks who have spontaneous desire, I've noticed a trend, and I don't know if others would say this in the field, but what I've noticed just in my clinical practice of over a decade is that folks who have spontaneous desire as a more predominant desire style also tend to have a more sensitive accelerator. And so that might be, I wonder if that's sort of what you're speaking to, Jimmy, on like, I kind of joke like, the house can have like a little bit on fire and you're like, we got time, This is,
A lot on
it
fire,
hasn't
yeah.
engulfed the place yet, because there might be just fewer and farther between things that really hit the brakes, that sex is just really motivating and either pleasurable, satisfying. There's something about it that is really incentivizing for folks, again, just sort of generally what I've seen, who have more responsive desire also tend to have more things that hit their brakes.
Yeah, like I'm still thinking about the fire from a month ago and it's still bothering me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, that's something of a trend, right? And again, what we're not doing is trying to change each other, right? I'm not trying to make you have spontaneous desire. I'm not trying to make you have, responsive, but we are learning what our predominant styles are, and then how do we work with that, right?
Yeah.
So another trend that I see in that is, folks who tend to have more spontaneous desire also may have an experience where sort of stress is accelerating more than inhibiting, whereas I see it work the opposite way for responsive folks. So, I used to maybe, when I was a baby therapist, think that, stress affected everybody negatively when it came to sex, right? Like more stressed you are, the less desire, the less sexual function, like it's bad for your sexuality. And over time, we just know that that's not the case, that there are some people, many people, for whom stress accelerates their desire and accelerates their arousal because the actual act itself, whether solo or with a partner, is a stress reducer.
Right. And that's so tough for us folks who are really negatively affected by the stress, to have partners that find that stress kind of revs them up, because sometimes I'm like, are you a monster? There's a fire right now, but really like doesn't bother my partner. And it really, it seems like he's like, but this is the solution to that. It's like, oh, it's not my solution. That's so hard to navigate when two people have different ways of
It's so hard
responding.
The more I learn about this, I'm like, I don't even know how two people ever can agree to have sex. I genuinely don't even.
Yeah, it can be
Relationships are such a mind boggle. The more you learn about them, the more you study it, the more you experience it. It's kind of amazing how people make their differences, workable over time. And, the reason why we talk about this as a desired difference and not a mismatch. We're very intentional with that language because, the idea of mismatch kind of implies that there's match.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that match is not something that is consistently experienced among partners.
Right.
Even if you have relatively similar libidos, there's still going to be plenty of moments where you're not available, you're not into it, something's going on. And so I like to tell people, like, match is not the goal.
Right.
It's just not the goal. And that hopefully takes a level of pressure off as well, because that's, in my eyes, after doing this for a while, it's not the most realistic thing to match it all up. We're not trying to change you. We're trying to work with your differences. And the more you understand some of these things, right, that there's nothing wrong with you if you have responsive desire. There's nothing wrong with you if stress hits your brakes. Once we know that, though, stress is, by the way, one of the most, significant variables that affect libido, both positive and negative. But once you learn that, then we can start to work with that, right? How can we help to bring you into the moment? What stressors can we remove? And what stressors do we need to work around, right?
And I find it so fast. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I just find it so fascinating that sometimes there's an external, like I can add to Emily's burdens. I can add to Emily's stress, by just not caring about the mental load or not caring about the domestic labor, or, so she's absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. And I can also, and obviously that can affect libido. But at the same time, even if there is someone that's doing everything that they can do, you can still have your own internal stuff going on that affects your libido. And so it's just, it's so hard for partners not to take it upon themselves and think like, oh, clearly, like, look at me, I'm doing everything right. And she or he is still not, like, they have no desire for me. It's so difficult to not take that as a form of rejection, but that goes back to being able to have those vulnerable talks where it's like, it's not you, you're doing everything. Like, I'm not trying to reject you, but it's still fascinating how sometimes it's us, sometimes it's internal.
And Lauren, you did such a wonderful job in your book talking about how there are individual factors that get in the way of couples experiencing desire, and there are also relational factors. You mention a lot of these in the book too. I mean, clearly what we've been talking about, couples that have a mismatch with a spontaneous and responsive desire. There's the Gottman's 4 horsemen that Jimmy and I love to talk about. The pursue-withdraw pattern can get in the way.
Yes.
Different interests in sexual activities in general, or the mental load. There's just so many different ways there's so many different things that can get in the way relationally and individually.
Yeah. And then, the third is more globally, right? What's going on around us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Culturally and socially, watching the news lately is horrific. And for some people, that's going to just kill their libido. And that's totally understandable, right? Yeah. Again, there's going to be other people's where it's going to rev them up as a way to seek comfort and to seek, stress reduction. And neither of those is wrong.
And plenty of partners who are taking that personally, when they really don't need to be.
To have a really, solid and secure relationship, particularly in the area of like sexuality and intimacy, it really invites a level of vulnerability that we need to be willing, at least in part, to step towards. Because it's vulnerable to say, hey, I have desire for you. Would you like to come do this with me? It's vulnerable to hear, now's not a good time for me.
Yep.
It's vulnerable to experience the tape that goes through your mind when you hear that. And then it's vulnerable to let your partner know what tape is playing right now.
Oh, it's so hard. I still struggle so much just to say, like, when that happened, I felt rejected, even though I don't think you meant to reject me. That's so vulnerable and
That's
so
hard.
And I love how you point out in the book that, like, I mean, like, I'm going to butcher the way that you say it, but the point is like, if someone is not how do I say this? But like, if I was being vulnerable and somebody was kind of like punishing me for it, you're obviously going to stop. You're not going to want to do that anymore. And it kind of goes to the same for sex. If you're having painful sex and you can't tell your partner that for a number of different reasons, it's obviously natural that you're going to try to avoid that in the future. And therefore, even when they try to come over and kiss you, you're going to be like, oh, please don't, because I'm afraid that this is going to lead somewhere, and they don't know what's going on, and you don't really fully know what's going on. So it just goes back to that communication and being able to be vulnerable with each other and say, hey, this is hurting. We got to figure out something else to do here.
Yeah, yeah. It is all so vulnerable. It's taking a risk. It's putting your honest truth out there. And, because our partnerships can be so important, significant, that, for many of us, it's one of the most, or if not the most important relationship of our life.
Yeah.
You don't want to lose it. And our relationships feel sometimes a lot more fragile to us than they actually are. Our partners might really be a lot more resilient and open and flexible than we sometimes assume. And so again, that negativity bias is going to have you go, oh boy, there's no way they're going to receive that with warmth. There's no way they're going to look at me with admiration or fondness after I admit that I had this thought or I felt this way.
Really
And in
tough
reality,
for people too, who've experienced bad reactions to them being vulnerable in the past.
Sure, of course.
That's right.
They might be bringing
That's
that
right.
into their current relationship.
That's right. That's right.
And I like
so-
how you say that to make sure that we're not demonizing just because your partner has a higher desire than you do, that isn't bad. And yet, I mean, I'm not speaking for men, but especially from men, because we do have a habit of not really truly understanding how the depths of your sexuality and how to exactly go about the correct way to, I don't know, foreplay and just treating you like an oven instead of a microwave. We do get labeled as like, oh, he always wants it. And I can understand the frustration because he wants it, and yet you don't feel like he's putting in the work in the other areas that would turn you on. So of course you're angry. Like, oh, you always want something that you're not actually learning about how to, like, from my side, from my perspective, you're not seeing it through my lens. And of course that's frustrating.
Yeah. And I think, we have a struggle because if you're a man who has higher libido than your partner, you fit into a stereotype. We have a stereotype about that if there's a desire difference, the man is higher, the woman is lower.
Sure, which is
that is not true. It also doesn't even take into account, non-binary folks.
Right.
Right.
And so, I think there's a cultural piece. I have a hypothesis. I don't know that I have research to back this up. I'm sure there is, now that I think about it.
Opinions are welcome on this.
But my clinical experience tells me that many men in our culture have been really injured by the framework in which we raise men, by the patriarchal sort of way that we say, boys, buck up, deal with it, go to your room, take your emotions elsewhere. Yeah. And where a lot of boys and men really sort of look to sex as maybe one of the only ways that they can ask for comfort and care.
Yeah.
And so sometimes high libido, right, in connection. So sometimes high libido is just high libido, but sometimes part of the equation is it's connection seeking, and it may be one of the only sort of ways that you know how to ask for that. 100%. And so when I'm working with men who have higher libido in their partnerships, we're talking about that. What is it like for you to ask your partner for comfort and care? When do you do that? How do you do that? How is it for you to do that, right? Yeah. And there's many times, very sadly, that they say, I don't go to my partner for comfort and care. The only time I reach for them is through physical touch. And the physical touch can often be then conflated with always sexually motivated.
Yeah.
When I work with couples, I'd say almost every time when I've seen a man who is the higher libido partner, and we talk about is this really the only thing that motivates you? When you know, do you just, you never want to be held, you never want to be kissed, you never want to have your back scratched, or it always has to be sex? And we deconstruct it almost every time. I can't even think of a time where somebody said, no, that's all I want is just sexual. I only want penetration.
Yeah.
It has to be this or nothing.
Right.
I've never had someone say that to me.
I'd like to, if I may, get a little personal too. I used to think that I was like a really high drive type person, but just to kind of support your theory there, I didn't realize that for me, and this could be an anxious attachment thing as well. I know some of my followers will relate to this. I was afraid to ask for other forms of affection, just a hug or something, partially because I'd been rebuffed in the past and it hurt. But I noticed that my partner never said no to sex. So that was the thing what I defaulted to every time I needed any sort of comfort or connection. They talk about that a lot in the attachment literature as solace sex, where we seek it out to feel ensured that the connection is still strong. And when I practiced asking for affection and connection in other ways, when I learned to just say, I had a really rough day, could I have a hug? I noticed that unreal libido that I thought that I had, I don't know what you would call that, but someone who thinks maybe that their libido is even excessive, it really dropped down, and not in a bad way, like in a manageable way. And I realized I was using sex to try to get hugs, which makes me so sad. And I think, like you said, that's probably more of something that men experience, but definitely there are women, especially anxious women, who do that too.
Yes. Well, and we talked about, when the man is the higher libido partner, assuming a heterosexual partnership, which, there's also, plenty of, queer, non-binary folks. And they seem to struggle with this. It seems different. It seems, because there's some deconstruction around sexuality already happening when you identify, yourself as queer or non-binary or trans. So, there's already deconstruction that happened maybe previous to libido differences or navigating some of this. But speaking to, in heterosexual pairings, my theory is that women, because the stereotype is that the man has the higher libido in the partnership, women can often feel a lot of shame about that.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
They can feel really alone in that. They feel like something's wrong with them in that. Same with men who have lower libido in their partnerships, right? Anything that sort of defies the stereotype is going to make you feel like something's wrong with you, like you're the exception. And, there's more and more research coming out that's saying the higher libido and lower libido partners in these dynamics can be someone of any gender. It doesn't follow that stereotype. But when, you're using sex as maybe the only way you know how to ask for comfort, we certainly see that come out in some attachment sort of ways, right? And I think that, that's some of the work that we're called to do, right? Because some of it is, I just really like sex and I want to have sex, and that's
sure,
fine.
And that's okay.
That's okay. But when it starts to feel like almost like compulsive or urgent, I'm always curious about that, right? Like, what is that? What is it doing for you? What does it mean to you? There's usually more to it than that when it feels really urgent or pressured.
There was definitely, for me personally, it was like a fear behind it too. Like, if this doesn't happen, something terrible is going to happen. That's not somebody who's seeking out sex just because they like it, That's like something else is going on that's worth looking into.
Right. And so, the work is, with partnerships where there's differences, can we expand our sexual experience so that it's not just one linear hierarchical way or nothing? When we approach each other, can we do that with a lot of compassion and care so that when I approach you for sex, I'm doing that with a willingness to hear both yes and no? When I turn down my partner for sex, just realizing that that's vulnerable. And so trying to be, compassionate and kind in that, and not, harsh and brash. Sometimes it means finding other ways to connect. Hey, maybe I'm a no to this type of experience, but I could be a yes to something else. And so we can kind of take it out of that binary, and then the other is, for the lower libido partners, often ones with responsive desire, at least in my experience, it's exploring what gives them a sense of pleasure and what would be intrinsically motivating for them, just for them. What kind of touch would be just for you, not just to satisfy a partner, not just to try to, show up for their desire, but what would touch look like that's just for you?
Which is so important, because some people don't think like that.
They don't think like that. And
Jimmy, you asked earlier, you were saying, you asked Lauren, like, what kind of things could I do or say to make sure that my responsive desire partner is like digging this and full consent. And I really appreciate it when my partner says, like, hey, I'm really in the mood, but I know because you said earlier that you're not, but what kind of thing would you like to do tonight that might, and that really, like, when he's not even making the request, he's just like, nothing's off limits. You pick the thing that we do, and I'll be excited about that. I think that gives him a lot of reassurance that I'm into it.
Yeah.
So that's
and it's
helpful.
Okay that thing, like if your partner were to ask you, what kind of touch would you like that's just for you? No agenda, no build up to something else, but just touch that's for you. It's okay if that's not sexual touch.
Yeah, right. Sometimes it's not. It's not.
And you actually say in the book, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think you say that obviously if Emily says no to this kind of touch, but yes to this kind of touch, that it's so important that I can respond to that in a positive way, and not, because if you respond negatively, that really sets you up for, like it creates a struggle later on. But if you can respond positively in those moments, that really sets you up later for her to feel more comfortable and more it builds on itself instead of tears down.
Now the complexity here is that you might have an internal emotion about that, right? There might be times where sometimes you're wanting a type of experience.
Of course.
She's not up for it. That hurts. It's
disappointment.
disappointing. It's hard. And so we want to both honor that. We also want to kind of look at, what does that then translate to for my partner, right? Because if every time I say, hey, do you want to do something sexual, or where are you at on the scale? And they're honest with us. Or they say something like, hey, I would love to do like a cuddle and some kissing. And if that's, mostly matched with, great.
Right.
Here we go again. It's not sexual. It's not sad. It doesn't fill me up.
Right.
That's just sort of speaking to maybe experiences that are more one-sided, right? Where it's like maybe leaning too far towards one person's experience. That's where you get into the like all or none, right? Either touch is sexual or we're not doing it.
Right. And that's not to say that obviously if you're having I forgot what word, you don't like the word mismatch. If you're having a big difference where it's like going back to like bids, if you're giving out bids and you're consistently being met with, well, I just don't want to do these category of things, then like I think that it's important to at least think about going and seeing someone like you, where it's like, hey, let's get a third party involved, because like I don't want to start creating a narrative about you, and I'm feeling pretty rejected because we haven't had sex in 3 weeks, and it's just like, so like I think we need to make sure, like for me, therapy was never, I should have gone to therapy. We should have gone to therapy immediately. Instead, we waited till year 7, like people do, when they're just like completely dismantled and the whole thing is shattered. So, I would encourage people to, you don't need to have this stigma against going to see someone. A third party can be so helpful in helping you navigate these things. And like you said, it's valid if your partner, let's say you're the higher libido partner, you're a lower libido partner,
continues to sort of say, hey, I'm not interested in something sexual. I want something else, something else, something. And over time, you're saying, hey, now the scales are tipping a little too far away from sort of what I'm wanting. Yeah. And it's not, this is becoming somewhat of a concern for me, right? Like we're just really veering away, or we're avoiding sex. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely valid to have a sit down at a calm moment, not, bring it up in a harsh startup, but to sort of gently say, hey, I've noticed that over X period of time, you maybe haven't been as interested, or, you're not wanting that. And there's some feelings coming up for me, and I thought maybe we can talk about it so that I can better understand where you're coming from, where we're at, and we can talk about what we want to do from here, or how do we want to navigate this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
I want to apologize too, because I caught myself earlier using the word mismatch, and I could just see, oh no, she's cringing. And I want to remind myself how important it is to use the word difference instead of mismatch, because there's not a match that we're looking for. We should be, navigating
and that's just
the
my
differences.
Thing. You can
it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. Honestly, I wish there was more of that in the attachment world too. I hate seeing people talking about the way that they respond in their relationships, whether more anxiously or more avoidantly. And there's a real idea that there's a perfect match and a mismatch there too. And there's really not. It's just differences that we need to learn, that we need to, have a lot of compassion for our partners and navigate those differences as well.
And if you're someone who's familiar with attachment, you can have a secure relationship and have libido differences.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely,
I think that's
you can.
Pretty common. So I also think that that's important to sort of name, right? That if you're working on your connection, you're building a secure sort of base together. That doesn't mean you're going to have no issue when it comes to differences. You're just going to keep having differences. It just means you're going to do maybe a more effective job of talking about it and moving through those moments, rather than having it just sort of tear you up and tear you apart.
Really well said. Well, we could probably sit here talking to you all night about this, but to kind of wrap things up, I was wondering what would be the best piece of advice that you could give partners who are experiencing a really big mismatch in their libidos? Yeah. If you could only give them just one little golden nugget. I know that's what we've talked about all night, but this is just to kind of recap and remind them.
Yeah. I think, flexibility is one of sort of the number one things that I recommend. That sex, intimacy, asking for connection, asking for closeness, whether that's physical or otherwise, that there's a flexible sort of approach, a growth mindset, if you will, around what that can look like, right? Because the more flexible you are with how you can be intimate together, including how you can be sexual together, the more sexual you're likely to be, or the more satisfying and pleasurable those experiences are likely to be. So I think flexibility is a big one.
Well said. Yeah, the rigidity and narrow-mindedness that can creep into sexual relationships are really big perpetrators of the problems, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jimmy, do you have a final question for her too?
No,
I know.
That's perfect. No? I'm sorry. I was happy with your final question.
Okay, great. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us today. I think the listeners got a lot out of this. If you guys are looking for Lauren, you can find her on Instagram. That's where I follow her, at Dr. Lauren Fogel Mersy. And I would also highly recommend that you pick up her book, DESIRE, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. It is fantastic. And Jimmy and I love it, and you guys will too.
Yes. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you, guys.